problem is what we typically encounter, where we collect some data, which we often call statistically observations, which I'm going to call Y. But rather than the data itself, we want to reason about some underlying phenomena. Right? We want to understand something which perhaps generated this data, where the data came from, make some reasonings which aren't directly measurable, but are related to the data that we have. The way we normally write this is that we have a forward model which relates these two things together. So the forward model goes from this latent, hidden, unobservable phenomena which we care about to the data we observe. And we also have some stochastic error term, epsilon, which we'll talk a bit more about later. So you get this very common formulation. F can be all manner of things, depends on the problem. But most of the things we'll talk about today are linear forward models. So an example of an inverse problem is in computed tomography or magnetic resonance imaging, which are very common tools which are used in the medical domain. And these are ways where we can construct images of what's going on inside of a body. But we can't directly measure these things. And in the case of MRI, which is something I know more about than CT, the measurements we collect are actually complex value data in the frequency domain. If you have questions about MRI, we do have some experts in the audience. We're very fortunate to have them with us on campus. And what we want to go is from this complex value frequency domain data to the underlying image. And in this case, the forward transformation is a well-known, well-studied function. It's just the inverse Fourier transform. However, in the case of accelerated imaging, which is an approach people are very interested in, we're trying to go from just a subset of measurements in our data domain Y and make inferences about what the image is, the underlying images. Another example of an inverse problem is depth estimation from multi-view stereo. So in this case, we have two images from two cameras, which are a certain fixed distance apart. And we're trying to make inferences about how far away things are in the scene. And here we have a forward model which relates the latent information and one of the images to the other one. So we're trying to resolve what the misalignment between the two images, which is an estimate of the relative depth. Another example that I've been involved in, I'll talk a bit more about in a minute, is inferring quantitatively metabolism from a set of MRI data, where there are a couple of properties, which are physiological properties, X1 and X2, which explain this sequence of data that you see in the top. And here, again, the forward model is given by some physics, MRI physics. Another problem of interest to me is in shape modeling. So in this case, we're trying to derive, this is a patient with Alzheimer's disease, and we see some changes over time. And we want to derive what are these shape changes over time? How much expansion or contraction has there been in different parts of the brain, which could be a useful interpretable biomarker given these two bits of data. And finally, just one which people might be more familiar with is this idea of super resolution or de-blurring. I'm just trying to give a few examples of, in this case, we have this noisy, blurry image on the left-hand side of a guinea pig, and the true image on the right-hand side is this high-resolution sharp image. Now, one of the key points about these types of models, and we have these are related. So the high-resolution latent image X explains the observed blurry downsampled image Y as a blurred and downsampled version of the image. So the forward transformation here is a downsampling, so reducing resolution and blurring operation. And this brings us on to ill-posedness. And the easiest way to define ill-posedness is to think about what's well-posed. So a well-posed estimation problem is one which would have a solution which is unique and depends continuously on the data. And for most of these inverse problems, these are ill-posed, which means that any inference is very sensitive to small changes in your data. So they don't necessarily depend continuously on your data, and there might not even be one unique solution. So if we step back to the super resolution problem here, given one blurry image, there are going to be many possible latent images which can explain it. And in the example, which I'll talk about in a few moments, related to the MRI metabolism estimation, we can actually look at the function on a voxel-wise level. And these maps on the right-hand side, they're red where they have high probability for any pairs of these two parameters. So the two maps are just different examples where the true value of these metabolic parameters, the OEF and the DBV, is given by the black cross. And the probability of any of the other values, just given the data, is given on the graph. And as you can see, we don't really know, just given the data, what value we should pick to infer. It's very ill-posed. If you do maximum likelihood inference on this, you just end up with noise. So we can also think about this ill-posedness by considering the set of solutions that exist within some epsilon noise bulb. And these are almost equivalent in terms of their error. If you pass them through the forward model, this fx prime minus y, they're almost exactly the same distance apart. And there was this very nice paper in the super resolution GAN paper from a few years ago, where they say, well, the pixel-wise best solution, which you might get, is this one in the middle. But there's this manifold, this set of possible solutions which all look like plausible images. And so in this particular paper, the way they illustrated this is, well, this is kind of the average of all of them, which you might get from a particular type of model. But what you might want to understand is this whole manifold or just a point on this manifold of data. It's not the true value. There is no true best super resolved image because you don't have the information to super resolve it exactly. There is also an issue in terms of ambiguity in that any noise that we introduce in our data adds this irreducible uncertainty, sometimes referred to as the aleatoric uncertainty. So the way we would traditionally try and combat things like this is through regularization. And for Bayesians like me, you call regularization prior knowledge, some kind of expectation about the latents. So in traditional imaging, people would use things like smoothness. So you'd say, well, I expect my image to be piecewise smooth, for example. That's how most of the real world, if you take an image with a camera, most of the real world is broken up into piecewise chunks, which are of similar color or texture. But these require some heuristic weighting factors. So this is an example from my PhD. If you fiddle with the regularization level, you get very different inferences about what the true shape change is between these two images. If you have very low levels of regularization, it overfits the noise. If you regularize too much, then you end up with a blurry mess and it's harder to make specific judgments about what the changes are. And most approaches will fail to, most regularization strategies won't capture any amount of spatial heterogeneity. So if you have changes over space, if you're expecting different amounts of smoothness in different parts of your data, they don't account for that naturally, although there are kind of data-driven approaches which can do this as part of a more Bayesian inference strategy. In traditional inference for these types of models, there's several classes of methods have been derived, often for each specific application. So in the case of computed tomography, there's this very common algorithm called filtered back projection. And this gives you a very neat, simple algorithm which gives you a CT image from some data. One of the things about traditional inference strategies is that they often came more from a mathematical perspective, and they come with some nice properties like strong convexity guarantees, which is obviously a useful property. It gives you some uniqueness of minima. And the inference might be via direct optimization or discretization. And it can be a little bit slow. There's lots of hyperparameters. It's you end up having to make it practical, you have to introduce a lot of heuristics. And so people have turned to machine learning, which is now the solution for all problems, as you've probably encountered, which, from my perspective, is just generalizable statistical pattern matching. That doesn't make it bad. That's just, it's the set of mechanisms by which it makes decisions. And this is an inductive model that makes predictions on new data, having been trained on previous input-output pairs. For the most part, there are many other strategies. I'm not going to talk about all of these things. But the nice thing about machine learning is it can be very efficient with high-dimensional data. And we can also use it to circumvent the per-instance optimization we would traditionally do. So in traditional inference, you'd run optimization for a particular pair of images, say, and that could take several minutes. Now with machine learning, you spend several days training your big chunky GPT whatever model, and then inference is very fast. So there's three main uses for machine learning and inverse problems, which I'm going to talk about now. So the most naive approach is to create pairs of observable data. So in the case of super resolution, your super resolved images and the corresponding latents. So the corresponding latents in that case are the super resolved images and some downsampled data. And then this assumes we have this ground truth knowledge of our latents, and then you train it as a straightforward regression type of problem. Alternatively, and probably more consistent with the way we think about these types of problems, you can bake the forward model, which in most cases is the physics which defines the forward model, into the learning process. So in this case, we have an encoder which takes our data, which predicts a latent representation of the data, which we then map through our forward model and see how close does our latents, when pushed through the forward model, match our data. And something which I'm not going to dwell on any further is just that sometimes these forward models can be very expensive to compute, and so machine learning can be used to approximate those. Yes?
Sorry, I was a bit confused there. So E theta of Y is what the observable. So first of all, how are you getting a ground truth X?
It's a great question. So in some cases, you can, and for being latent, they're not normally observable. In the case of something like super resolution, you can say, well, they are observable because I have a high resolution image and I downsample it.
Okay, so you get some really, really good measurements to say it's as close to perfect as possible.
Exactly.
Fair enough. And then E theta of Y.
E theta of Y would be an encoding, machine learning derived encoding of the observed data, which tries to derive what the latent would be.
Okay.
So in this case, if we were doing super resolution, take a blurry image in, predicts high resolution image, and then downsamples it and says, does this match?
Okay, that's what I thought originally. Never mind, I was confused because when it was F of E theta.
Yeah, so the F is the forward model. So F
of the latent.
of the latent, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, no, but thanks for the clarification. Yeah, it's an important point to make. So the forward model is not something which is learned, it's something which is part of the physical system. This is in contrast to generative models, which are very similar in some respects, where the forward model is learned as part of the learning process. So and the latents have no fixed meaning. So in this case, the latents have a fixed meaning with respect to some process. How are we doing? The time. I'm going to very briefly run through one example of in a little bit more detail, and then give some more high-level quick pictures of different approaches. So this is an example of a project which I got involved in when I first moved to Sussex a few years ago. And this was the metabolic inference from this quantitative bold MRI data. So we had some colleagues based up at CISC who were capturing data using what was called a streamlined QBold process. And where you collect data which looks like this, and they fitted some maps, and the maps look like this, which looks like noisy junk. And Mara came to me and she said, we've got this interesting data problem. Do you think machine learning could help? And I said, this looks like a blurry mess. I'm not sure what we can do, but we'll take a look. And it turned out from a bit of inspection that when you use any kind of least squares type of inference, some of the parameters of the model are well defined and others are extremely noisy. They're very poorly identifiable given the data, just given the data itself. And the approach that, and there have been some previous very traditional Bayesian approaches that have been taken to look at this, which had a lot of unreasonable and inaccurate prior information, and they didn't work very well. So I decided to try something really simple. I tried to do the first option, which is I can create some pairs of observable like data based on knowing what the forward model is and knowing plausible values of the latents, and train a neural network discriminatively. Can I just predict the latent given what the data looks like, which is something which had been explored previously. And then for the second, did this as a two-stage process. And the second part of the process, I incorporated the forward model into that as well. So the first part is trained using synthetic data, where these latents, these unknown metabolic parameters, are just known and simulated, and I just created a load of synthetic data. And the second stage was actually trained on real data. I'm not going to dwell on the specifics because there's other more. Sorry, Zoom's just popped up with some questions. But essentially, because the synthetic data was only on a per voxel, per pixel basis, you couldn't incorporate any amount of spatial information into that because I can only construct these latents pixel-wise. I had no knowledge of what they should look like. I had no prior knowledge of what they should look like over space. However, in the second stage, I could add 2D convolutions. Say, well, I expect the latents, these metabolic parameters, to be smooth in space. And so here are some example maps, and I still have a heuristic parameter, which is how much spatial smoothness I want it to include. And so we had a bunch of data which we used to train it, and we got some results which went from these are two conditions. The one on the second column is where the patient is breathing normally, and the third column is when they're hyperventilating. So you'd expect to see some change in the metabolic parameters as a consequence, which we can't with the traditional weighted least squares approach. But with the approach we developed, we found that there were some quite clear distinctions which seemed to make sense and were biologically plausible. We do not have ground truth data, though, because we can't measure the metabolism in vivo, sadly, by sticking probes in. And this has been used to, it's subsequently been used in a study on bipolar disorder. Julie, did you have a question?
Well, tell me if it's a question. Yeah, I guess it's a question about.
You can have it now.
So I'm just trying to understand, make sure I understand. So you're building a synthetic noise model, and then you've got a kind of prior for smoothness. Sure, that works better with these squares. How do you have something like compressed sensing, where you're assuming some sparsity in the domain anyway, you're inherently doing smoothness without noise model?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it could have done it without this kind of first stage of the first stage is effectively learning a data-specific prior. That's the way I would think about it. You could solve it as a compressed sensing problem from the beginning and just trying to do inference. And the reason I did it this way is the first part of the project was done by a final year project student. So it was already done, and there was some code which I could run. And then the second part was the approach which was more natural for me to take.
Okay.
But yeah, you're completely right. And we'll talk a little bit more about compressed sensing in a minute. But yeah, it's a good question. I'm now going to give a little bit more of a high-level overview of some different types of models which exist and are quite interesting. So some of you might have heard of neural radiance fields, which for a while were the hottest thing in computer vision. They were introduced in 2020. They've since been overtaken by Gaussian splatting and since been overtaken by, I can't remember what the new version of Gaussian splatting is. It changes every year or so. But there was approximately 2,000 papers on this in a compressed range of like two and a half years. But it's a really simple and interesting idea where they fit a multi-layer perceptron, which is just a linear neural network, to some data given a forward model. In this case, we get a set of photographs of a scene from different angles, and we know the position of the cameras which have taken these images. And we build an MLP, which, given a position in space and an angle, it predicts the color of that pixel and the opacity of that pixel, and just ray trace. That's our, so you just, at fixed points along a line, you calculate what the observed color is in that camera image. And so we're just fitting a model to data. So it's not really machine learning. It's not learning anything. It's just a tool for fitting models to data. But this is fitting an MLP, which has some inductive biases. But the reason why these models are really interesting is that we're doing our classic inference, but our latent variables are now continuous. They're not discretized onto some grid. We're not calculating on some X, Y, Z pixel grid. They're just coordinates being input into a model, which seems like a neat property. So we, with the help of some PhD students in our lab, have been investigating how you could use these for making continuous estimates of shape changes in time. And so we now have a smooth model in time, but also a smooth model in space. And if anyone has questions, I'm sure Ice will be happy to explain that later. But as well, those of you who were at Sussex AI Day might have seen Kieran presenting this slide, which we've been looking at doing this for interpolating changes in ecological measurements. So we make some ecological measurements at specific points in space, and they record at certain points in time over the day, over a set of days. And we want to make some inferences about what's happening in between. So we can make broader judgments. And we might have some additional information about how similar locations are as well to help guide us. So this is effectively, in this case, we're using it as a smart interpolator, using the inductive bias of machine learning, but without really, it's not really learning, it's just model fitting. It's closer to a kind of traditional statistical analysis. So one of the things about all of these types of models is that regularization is pretty important still, even with machine learning. You need to tell it what properties do you like. And so there's been some work. So this is a paper called Hypermorph from a group at MIT. And they use a kind of direct learning of inverse problems. But they use this idea of a hypernetwork, which is a network given a particular strength of their regularization parameter. It can produce a network which will give you that regularization weighting. And so what we see in this video here is it interpolating as you would if you would have trained this model to use different regularization strengths, but it's still very computationally efficient at test time. So these kind of hypernetwork ideas are quite useful as a way of at least being able to control the level of regularization in a machine learning framework, because otherwise it's just baked into your model and you can't change it later. So another bit of work that we had done was just in a similar setting, can we predict the effect of the regularization on some downstream task? So if you're playing with these regularization levels, you probably care about what it does for a particular task at the end, rather than just being able to change them, because you don't know how much regularization is appropriate. It's still a heuristic because we don't, most of the time, we don't know what the true latent should be. So moving away from machine learning to direct inference, I just want to talk a bit about how we can use it as a form of regularization. So in the case of compressed sensing, which is making, in the case of MRI, we think of it as making an image of, in this case, a knee, where we do not observe all of the data, we just observe bits of it. And if you try and do this as a direct inference problem, this means you look at the data once and you make some prediction about what you think the observed data, the case-based in this case, the frequency domain data, and you make some judgment about what it thinks the image should have been. This doesn't necessarily respect the true data. There's no way of enforcing data consistency. So one approach which people have been looking at is, and this is a very popular approach in MRI reconstruction, is use machine learning to learn a regularizer. And so what you effectively have is a set of steps where you have a best guess of what your reconstruction is, and then you regularize that by some learn function, and then you follow a pair of gradients, one which is how do I update this to make sure it stays consistent with the data, and how do I update it such that it matches my regularization? Yes.
Sorry, I'm not quite getting how that solves the problem, because the variational network is learning against labeled data which has a particular value of regularized parameter limits.
It is, yes. Yeah, so the
As in you're getting a biased regulator. But as I understand it, the problem is to learn the right lambda.
in this case, it's not. In this case, it's actually not learning the right lambda. It is learning the form of what that regularization should be. So rather than, which is better than lambda, because lambda is just learning for, say, if we're doing imaging, we would often use total variation, which is this piecewise smoothness property. Here, we're saying it's not about learning the strength of that piecewise linearity. It's instead learning what are kind of shapes that we expect to see in a particular part of the brain. So it's kind of learning a prior with a fixed level of lambda attached to it.
Yeah, I guess I'm not understanding, but how do you find that fixed value of lambda which you're using to label?
You don't, you pick one and you hope for the best. I mean, this is still unfortunately a massive problem, and it will continue to be because naturally we have to include some heuristics. There's, yeah.
That kind of thing. But then what's the advantage of it just using a lambda to begin with?
So the advantage here is that we're using it, so here we're learning what the form of the prior is, not the strength of the prior. So rather than saying it's total variation, which is something I, as a human building a system, has designed, this is learning from the data. What is the best set of prior information I can use in order to create reconstructions which match my high quality data?
You're trying to create a low-dimensional embedding.
Essentially, it's creating like local patch-wise priors. There's some sort of illustration of what it wants to look for patch-wise. So this is a paper from Kirsten Hamonic from 2017, and there's been a lot of work in this kind of. The thing about these types of approaches is it's learning very few parameters in a model. It's mostly doing direct inference in a very efficient way, but it has some learned set of regularization parameters. But I'm not sure I answered your question fully, but I'm going to carry on. Yeah, we can definitely talk about it more another time. The other thing which is been very interesting of late is generative models. I'm sure everybody's heard about generative models because that seems to be how people describe most of machine learning these days. Generative models are just models that understand a distribution of data, but have kind of been taken to mean large language models in recent years. But I'm not talking about large language models. I'm talking more about things like diffusion models. So those of you who played with DALI will have seen the outputs of diffusion models, or variational autoencoders, which are, as I mentioned earlier, similar to inverse models, but both the latent and the forward models are learned. Now, if we're in a situation where we do have access to a good selection of these latents, so high resolution images or high quality MRIs, then we can train a generative model and use that as a regularizer. So this has become quite popular. The Zoom gets a bit upset in here for some reason, where we are penalizing the distance of our generated latent according to a learned generative prior. So we're trying to say, does our latent match the kind of distribution of images we would expect to have seen, given I've trained it on some nice clean data? Which is a And it then uses this kind of learned embedding into the generative model Z. I'm not going to dwell on the details of this, but one of the nice things about using a generative model as a prior is generative models are naturally offer some degree of interpretability because you can draw samples from them. You can see, what does my generative model understand about data? And so this is, which you probably can't see very well. In fact, these are just a set of samples that they quite washed out. But you can basically see when we only observe a very small fraction of the data, you can see there's some changes in the reconstructed image, which are all kind of plausible under that under the observed data. So I'm going to try and skip forward. So everyone loves machine learning. It's really fast hardware, but there are risks. And some of the risks, the ones Drew has been bringing up which I completely agree with, is related to the biases and preferences that we have designed into these systems and we don't necessarily understand. So if we put a prior on something, if we say we want it to be piecewise smooth, or something like that, how has that been taken? How much can the model describe that? We also have all these architectural differences. These all introduce we got this new catch-all term, inductive biases, which is just all the stuff the model likes, the ways the model likes to explain things, as well as our optimization choices. I mean, just a simple choice of learning rate has a huge impact on any of these performances. And you also might find that different types of models might appear to have similar training performance. They might have similar levels of accuracy, etc., but very different failure modes. And these might be poorly described. And there's just a general lack of formal guarantees for anything. So potential for adversarial attacks. So this is from the famous one pixel attack, where you can flip a classification label. This is for a very different type of model, but if you're trying to do classification, you can change one pixel in the image, and it will change the classification from to being from a bassinet to a paper towel or cup soup. There's a load of examples in this one pixel paper. The other thing is that models are often black boxes, right? We don't really know how they make decisions, which bit of the data was important. So again, this is for a classification setting. There's techniques like GradCam, which kind of help, but it doesn't tell you the set of images which will give you similar responses, and they can be useful for highlighting some of the deficiencies. As we all know, there's a huge data set bias issue in machine learning, and data sets are unlikely to be representative, and they are unlikely to treat all demographics equally. So there was a paper fairly recently on MRI reconstruction, where they looked at different groups, young adults, medium-aged adults, and old adults, and they found that performance was different for these different groups. And this is going to be due mainly to biases within the data set, as well as potential biases in how the model's constructed, what kind of solution it comes out with. And they tried different solutions for balancing, and it didn't seem to have that much of an impact. There might be reasonable outliers present in the data. There might be unreasonable outliers. So in this case, a group had implemented "can you see it?" had written "can you see it?" and into the data, and then they'd put it through these some different types of models and seen if it could try and reconstruct. So these models, if you're doing MRI reconstruction, you should be consistent with the data, even if the data looks a bit weird, because in the real world, when we're looking at deploying these tools, some people will have tumors in their brains at different positions, or lesions, or all kinds of oddities. And if we don't rely on the data and just rely on this prior distribution of nice, healthy people that were in our data set, it's not going to reconstruct the tumor. It will just say, yeah, everything looks fine, which is a terrifying prospect. And there have been examples. I mean, originally, when people were using generative models, they used this class of models called GANs, which was the flavor of the month for a couple of years. But GANs have some horrible properties, and they want things which look plausible. So when applied to these kinds of problems, they wouldn't paint tumors and say, oh, everything's healthy, which is madness if you wanted to deploy it. The other thing we find is that typical evaluation data sets and processing metrics actually might not give results that are representative of how well they work on any particular task. So when people look at tools like for image reconstruction, they'll say, well, what's the mean squared error? How much do the pixels deviate in terms of the intensity, the color of the pixel? Or there's this other measure called structured similarity. And this leads on to another issue of these types of models is we often don't quantify the uncertainty. And many of these problems are intrinsically uncertain. So something we've done very recently is we trained an ensemble. So we trained several sets of these MRI reconstruction algorithms. So something like 8 different models, but trained exactly the same way on the same data. They just differ based on the random initialization. And I'm going to go through a few of these. So the green image is the true, they're all different data in the different types of models. But the true image is given in green, the reference image, and then the different reconstructions are given with a red box around them. So hopefully you can see that the direct inference model, none of them particularly, they're like blurry versions of the reference, but there are a few differences between them. And we see, again, differences in the other model on the middle, and the one on the right is the most consistent. And so, okay, well, we can quantify this. So what does this mean? What does this mean for anything anyone would use a model for? And so we looked at that. We said, okay, how much does this affect the volume of different structures in the brain? So if we're going to say, do a study on morphometrics, we want to say, how much is this region of the brain changing over time or between different population groups? And we found surprisingly large percentage differences in volumes. So in some structures up to sort of 4 or 5%, purely as a consequence of how these machine learning models have been trained. That seems quite worrying. And I think we need to quantify uncertainty, but all of these models have very good metrics in terms of the standard things people measure, which is mean squared error, how much do the pictures look the same? But if we run a segmentation tool, the segmentation tool interprets them differently and gives us different results. So I find that scary, but it's very interesting. There's just so many modeling decisions to worry about. And the thing I worry about more than anything, the thing which actually keeps me up at night, is people treating these ambiguous, these naturally uncertain inferences as truth. So imagine you go to a doctor and they sort of have this magic bag and they pull something out of it and say, yeah, this one's definitely right. It could be any of these things, but I'm just going to say it's definitely this one. I just don't see how that's useful. I don't see how that's robust or trustworthy. We make strong assumptions on our distribution generalization, but we generally don't have a broad enough data set. We don't look at the worst case performance. How bad can it get? There's all the standard things us Bayesians worry about, like distributional choices, factorizations. The other thing which has plagued me in my whole research career is noise models are always wrong. We assume that we have pixel error, which is independent between pixels and is identically distributed. It's not true. And model misspecification. Our forward models probably doesn't contain everything, it contains some of the stuff. How do we deal with artifacts and the unknown? And yeah, supervised learning based on unknowable latents and unknowable noise. So this is an example of this ultra low field MRI. We've got this lovely little scanner which Finn sitting at the back works on up at CISC, which can create these pictures which are quite noisy, but we'd like to make some inferences and use them practically. But how would you do supervised learning when the only data available to you is corrupted with noise? It's madness. But I am optimistic still. There's lots of fun stuff going on. Generative models offer a lot of potential for understanding data distributions. There's increasing amounts of work about being Bayesian about neural networks and understanding uncertainty. There's all this work on PINs, physics-informed neural networks, which could provide more plausible constraints, better explainability. I think implicit neural representations are kind of a nice tool to avoid this arbitrary discretization of latents. And there's a lot of people working on trying to make these things trustworthy and robust, rather than just race to the finish line. And here's a picture which looks nice. So in summary, I've talked about inverse problems in imaging and how hopefully giving you a bit of a flavor about how these are ubiquitous across science and can be tricky to solve. Machine learning can be useful, and there's a few different ways we can use it. I haven't discussed anything about how you choose a loss function and how do you train these things, because they're all different. And I think we need to be careful about how we use these things in the real world to avoid overhyping things, because they can be useful, but we need to be careful. We know what's going on with them. So there's a handful of useful references. Thanks to all my collaborators, including our wonderful lab here. And any questions? River's got a question. Please.
You were talking about MSE and noise models and their issues on a pixel basis. But why wouldn't you use like a wavelet basis? So is there a problem with that kind of thing? Or why would you simulate noise on a pixel by pixel level? That seems like a natural images.
Okay, yeah, I wouldn't. So in your in your loss function, you would typically use a mean squared error, but you could use a different form of basis. I mean, the thing which we've been looking at is using structured Gaussian, so trying to model the correlation in noise, which you can also do with wavelets. But our experiments and investigations into that haven't found it particularly easy to work with. So far, we were looking at the dual tree complex wavelet, and it ended up being more complicated than the complicated thing we were trying to do. So far, but I mean, you know, we could well have missed something. You know, wavelets is not my area of expertise.
It feels like quite a natural way to add realistic noise to images. I think that's what my area of expertise is.
Yeah, it's more about the fitting term, so how you assess how close things are. So you'd need to come up with a set of wavelets that some wavelet coefficients that add, which you say this is my additive noise, and then you still need to measure the distance to the true image data, to the true observed data with some function.
Okay, in the sense that it's not easy to just add a Gaussian to wavelets.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
On this conversation, what sort of noise is this?
It
wouldn't be made noise.
So, okay, yeah. So in this case, this is the standard statistical assumption of noise, which is this beautiful equation here, where we say we have a normal distribution which is identically distributed, independent, and has some variance. And this is what you do if you do any least squares fitting problem. You're solving this, right? You're minimizing the squared error, which is minimizing Gaussian IID Gaussian noise. So people have worked on make it heteroscedastic, so it means the variance changes across your domain, but it doesn't account for the fact that usually with any model that we make and in our data itself, the noise is spatially correlated. In imaging problems, it's always spatially correlated. We don't make a mistake at one pixel or make a completely uncorrelated mistake at the next. And I'll very quickly show we came up with this structure where this is the traditional approach. This is a VAE trained on faces. We came up with a structure for trying to infer the structure and the correlation of the mistakes that you make, or the expected correlation in mistakes that you make. But I'm not going to dwell too much. We'll talk about that another time, because that's outside of the scope of today's session. If I put it as bonus, but I'm glad it was there anyway. Yeah, Thomas.
So I was wondering, other than making repeated measurements, how can you actually tease apart what's noise and what's a systematic disclosure on just a non-invertible forward model?
That is a excellent question, and there isn't really. You need to just make repeated measurements of a system, and I guess if your noise isn't temporarily stationary, then it becomes even more complicated.
And is there some sort of knowledge in kind of injecting some sort of domain knowledge about what your forward model might be doing to get the inverse of it? I don't know, with lenses or something, you know what lens distortions are like you don't treat as black box.
So I guess what you can have is a forward model which has multiple components, which could include, you have a general lens model and you have some model for aberrations. So you can just add onto your forward model such that it can describe these phenomena, and you have some latents which describe how much corruption do you expect, how much of an effect do you expect this to have. And then you can use something like model comparison at the end, where you say, well, how well does this explain it, given some trade-off with complexity. I mean, that's the kind of traditional Bayesian way I would think of it, but I don't know what people do nowadays. So things like Phil might have a better idea. Something is about lenses. Just in case, does anyone else have any questions? Just in case, otherwise I'm happy to take Dhruva's question. Anyone else got any questions? Oh, Peter's got a question. Oh. Okay.
Measurement starts by your definition of machine learning in context of like statistical learning. What do you think about and most examples of the game where again in context of statistical model, probability, approaches, what's your motivation to take that approach as opposed to pure learning approaches that don't consider distribution?
So the question for those on Zoom, I don't know how many we have on Zoom, but the question for those on Zoom was about why take this kind of probabilistic statistical formulation as opposed to black box deep learning and the kind of traditional discriminative modeling. I guess for me, I feel so inherently skeptical about something that we can't interpret, we can't introspect, that we can't know how its reasoning mechanism works. We know that you can adversarially attack them and find holes in their reasoning, and that scares me as a tool which is going to be rolled out and used broadly in society. I don't see how you can, for problems like inverse problems, I don't see how you can reason about them without thinking about probability. I mean, I'm sure lots of people have published papers where they haven't reasoned about probability. They're like, black box, chuck data through, answer at the end, everyone's happy. But I can't think like that. And I am a proselytizing Bayesian, and I'm happy to, those who want to be converted, it's easier to talk to the converted already, obviously. Cool. I think we can let people go, but if people want to chat, happy to. Cool. Thanks for coming.
Okay, in the sense that it's not easy to just add a Gaussian to inference.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
On this concept, what sort of noise is this?
It
wouldn't be made noise.
So, okay, yeah. So in this case, this is the standard statistical assumption of noise, which is this beautiful equation here, where we say we have a normal distribution which is identically distributed, independent, and has some variance. And this is what you do if you do any least squares fitting problem. You're solving this, right? You're minimizing the squared error, which is minimizing Gaussian IID Gaussian noise. So people have worked on make it heteroscedastic, so it means the variance changes across your domain, but it doesn't account for the fact that usually with any model that we make and in our data itself, the noise is spatially correlated. In imaging problems, it's always spatially correlated. We don't make a mistake at one pixel or make a completely uncorrelated mistake at the next. And our very quickly show we came up with this structure where this is the traditional approach. This is a VIE trained on faces. We came up with a structure for trying to infer the structure and the correlation of the mistakes that you make, or the expected correlation in mistakes that you make. But I'm not going to dwell too much. We'll talk about that another time, because that's outside of the scope of today's session. If I put it as bonus, but I'm glad it was there anyway. Yeah, Thomas.
So I was wondering, other than making repeated measurements, how can you actually tease apart what's noise and what's a systematic distortion and just non-invertible forward model?
That is a excellent question, and there isn't really. You need to just make repeated measurements of a system, and I guess if your noise isn't temporally stationary, then it becomes even more complicated.
And is there some sort of mileage in kind of injecting some sort of domain knowledge about what your forward model might be doing to get the inverse of it? I don't know, with lenses or something, you know what lens distortions are like you don't have to treat as black box.
So I guess what you can have is a forward model which has multiple components, which could include, you have a general lens model and you have some model for aberrations. So you can just add onto your forward model such that it can describe these phenomena, and you have some latents which describe how much corruption do you expect, how much of an effect do you expect this to have. And then you can use something like model comparison at the end, where you say, well, how well does this explain it, given some trade-off with complexity. I mean, that's the kind of traditional Bayesian way I would think of it, but I don't know what people do nowadays. So things like Phil might have a better idea. Something knows about lenses. Just in case, does anyone else have any questions? Just in case, otherwise I'm happy to take Dhruva's question. Anyone else got any questions? Oh, Peter's got a question. Oh. Okay.
Measurement starts by your definition of machine learning in context of like statistical learning. What do you think about and most examples of the game where again in context of statistical model, probability, approaches, what's your motivation to take that approach as opposed to pure learning approaches that don't consider distributions?
Yeah, so the question for those on Zoom, I don't know how many we have on Zoom, but the question for those on Zoom was about why take this kind of probabilistic statistical formulation as opposed to black box deep learning and the kind of traditional discriminative modeling. I guess for me, I feel so inherently skeptical about something that we can't interpret, we can't introspect, that we can't know how its reasoning mechanism works. We know that you can adversarially attack them and find holes in their reasoning, and that scares me as a tool which is going to be rolled out and used broadly in society. I don't see how you can, for problems like inverse problems, I don't see how you can reason about them without thinking about probability. I mean, I'm sure lots of people have published papers where they haven't reasoned about probability. They're like, black box, chuck data through, answer at the end, everyone's happy. But I can't think like that. And I am a proselytizing Bayesian, and I'm happy to, those who want to be converted, it's easier to talk to the converted already, obviously. Cool. I think we can let people go, but if people want to chat, happy to. Cool. Thanks for coming.